So, chapter 15 of Genesis, the story of the covenant of the pieces, is fundamentally different from what we've been reading up till now in the story of Abraham, and that in several ways. First, as far as the nature of the content, we have here a chapter which focuses primarily on a movement towards covenant. Up till now, we've had promises given to Abraham. From here on in, we also move on to a different level. We move up a stage, if you will, and move to the level of covenant. Very fundamental concept, particularly in the book of Genesis. Another difference in this story is its nature. It basically deals with meeting between Abraham and God. Now, throughout all the stories of Abraham, God has a certain role, some more prominent, some less. But in this chapter, it's only God and Abraham. All other stories we have Abraham meeting with other characters involved in events. In this one, the whole event is a meeting between God and Abraham in and of themselves, without anybody else involved. And this also has effect on the nature of God's revelation towards Abraham. And that's already explicitly stated in the text that God appears before Abraham in a vision, right? It's not just God speaking to Abraham as we usually find, and God said to Abraham, but here God appears before Abraham in a vision. And as such, the whole description takes on more of a, if you will, a prophetic perspective, right? God revealing himself to his prophet Abraham. And this, of course, has far-reaching ramifications on how we interpret the story, because it takes a lot more of a symbolic nature, because it's described, at least in the beginning, as a vision, and therefore we that opens the door to search for symbolic meaning behind things and interpret it maybe somewhat more symbolically than we usually do in the stories of Abraham. Another unique aspect is, of course, how Abraham is depicted in this chapter, asking questions, having certain reservations. And now this is not the only place. We see it, for example, also in chapter 18, second part of it. But here it's very prominent, and we haven't seen this as of yet. So Abraham's character is definitely depicted somewhat differently in this chapter. And beyond all these aspects, also this chapter is quite challenging from an exegetical perspective. As far as interpretation, there are a lot of difficulties that arise as we read it. So what I will ask you to do at this stage is please open up your Bibles and read chapter 15 and do the following three things. Number one, please divide the chapter into two parts. How would you divide it? And then after you divide it into two parts, compare the two sections and see similarities, differences between the two sections. And finally, what difficulties arise upon reading this chapter as far as seeing it as a complete whole? Okay, so those are the three questions. Divide the chapter into two parts, which is quite clear. Two, compare the two parts, similarities, differences if you want. And also, as you read the chapter, try to see what difficulties arise in reading it as a one unit. Okay, so I suggest now that you stop the recording, take whatever time it requires, 10 minutes or whatever, to read the section from your Bibles, and then continue on with the lecture. So I hope you've done what was asked, and I hope you also noted quite clearly that the chapter divides into two sections. First section, verses 1 to 6, and the second section from verses 7 onwards till the end, verse 21. On what grounds do we divide it in such a way? Well, for starters, based on the content, right? The first section focuses on the topic of a promise of offspring, while the second one relates to a promise of the land. And first one is articulated as a promise, a verbal promise with an action of Abraham going outside. And here in the second part, it's not only a promise, but actually a covenant. And hence the name for the chapter at large, the covenant of the pieces, based on the animals that were split. Now, the big question in relation to reading this chapter is, how do we correlate between these two parts? Do we view them as one ongoing story with two events within them, but an integrated whole? Or no, we basically see two units that are connected together and put together one after the other, but each one should be approached separately as a separate story. And we'll begin with the problems and difficulties in reading this story as one consecutive large story. For starters, if we look at the end of the first section, there seems to be an ending, right? Let's share with you the text here so we can see verse 7. Let's just put it here, 1 second. Here we go. So we see, let's just put the share, sorry. Okay. Here, let's share screen. Here we go. Yeah. So if we look at verse 6, we see the conclusion of the first section, and he believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him as righteousness. That's like, it seems to sound like an ending, right? That concludes the first section. So here we have one aspect from a literary reading that seems to break the section into two, perhaps even two separate units. A second difficulty in reading the whole chapter as in one narrative is, of course, the chronological problem. Because the first section, when Abraham is taken out and sees the stars, seems to take place at night, whereas the second narrative discusses the sun setting. So there doesn't seem to be an ongoing chronological flow here between the two sections. One takes place at night, the other one in the evening. Of course, there are different possibilities of explaining that, but that definitely is a question that arises as we read through the text. And finally, as far as the content, we're dealing with two issues that are commonly interspersed and connected, namely the promise of offspring and the promise of land. So their appearance together makes sense, but in this chapter, they seem to be totally separate. In other words, it's a separate part that deals with the promise of the offspring with a conclusion, and then a totally separate section dealing with the promise of the land, and not as we're used to finding them integrated. God saying, "Go to the land, and I'll make you a great people. I'll make you into a great people, or to your offspring shall I give this land." Here, they seem to kind of stand one separate from the other, and that, of course, drives us all into the direction of reading them as two separate units. So we're going to grapple with that question of how to approach this chapter as far as seeing it as one whole or two separate units. And we'll do this by first reading through each section, and then we'll return and grapple with the larger question relating to the chapter. So let's let's start with the first part, namely the first 6 verses treating the promise of offspring. And the beginning of the story has the wording, right, after these things, right? After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. Now, how to approach this opening after these things, the Hebrew is achar hadvarim ha'ele, right? Achar hadvarim ha'ele. After these things is an important question for the continuation, because we see in this opening verse, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision, saying, "Do not be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield. Your reward is exceedingly great." So we see in this verse God comforting Abraham and encouraging him not to be afraid. And this is interesting because this is the opening of the chapter. We don't know why Abraham is afraid. Now, we've seen God encourage the other patriarchs as well, and also use the word, "don't be afraid." In fact, once with regard to Isaac, that's found in chapter 26, when he's in conflict with the Philistines over the wells. So after they redig, after he's asked to leave, they redig the wells. So God appears to Isaac in Beersheba and tells him not to be afraid. And we also have, with regard to Jacob, when he's about to go down to Egypt, God also tells him not to be afraid to go down. So we have God comforting, encouraging the patriarchs. But what's different here is, here we're not exactly certain why Abraham needs this comforting at this stage. We understand it with regard to Isaac because of his conflict with the Philistines. They're always arguing with him over the wells. We understand it with regard to Jacob, perhaps because he has concerns about leaving the promised land. Why does God encourage Abraham here? Now, one of the keys to answering this question is how we relate to the word "after these things." The term "after these things," achar hadvarim ha'ele, appears in all 8 times in the whole Bible, specifically achar hadvarim ha'ele, 4 times in Genesis, right? Twice with regard to Abraham. It also appears in the story of the binding of Isaac, and twice again in the story of Joseph, in the beginning with the sins of the ministers of Pharaoh, and also the story of the wife of Potiphar. So we have 4 times with regard to Abraham, and 2 times with regard to Abraham, and 2 times with regard to Joseph, 4 times in Genesis. And then it also appears twice in the book of First Kings, and also twice in the book of Esther. Actually, there it's the closest to what we find in our story, because it's not with the word vayehi achar hadvarim ele, but rather just like we have here, achar hadvarim ele, after these events. So it's a big question amongst our sages, the early sages, how to understand this term. Does it mean when we have achar hadvarim ele, as opposed to, for example, acharei hadvarim ele, just the added yod after achar? They're very similar, but the sages disagree as far as the difference between them. When we use the term achar hadvarim ha'ele right after these events, are we referring to an event that transpired immediately after? And if that's the approach taken, then right here after these things is directly connected to chapter 14. Or alternatively, to the opposite, when it says achar hadvarim ha'ele, it's long time after. Of course, this will affect how we approach our question of why does Abraham need encouragement? Why does God tell him, "do not be afraid"? So if we say these events come right after and following the previous chapter, the war of the 4 kings against the 5, as some of the early commentators including amongst the sages, said, then the fear of Abraham may be a consequence of the war. He's afraid that perhaps his enemies will now try to take vengeance, those who he overcame, or perhaps amongst some of the Jewish commentators, he is afraid that he might have killed righteous people in the war. Nice interpretation. And now God comes and tells him, don't be afraid. I'm your shield, which actually drives us back to the issue of war. I'll protect you. Your reward is exceedingly great. In other words, even if you did have sinful actions in the war, you still have great reward. So that's if we want to connect these fears to the previous chapter, whether it be he's fearful of vengeance or he's fearful that he might have sinned in the act of war. But if we say that these events are actually long after and not connected previously, Abraham's fear may be something else, not related to the events of the war, and therefore God wants to come and encourage him. As we'll see from the continuation of the chapter, it's clear that Abraham has different concerns here, right? So it's what's unique in this chapter, in this opening, is God comes and comforts Abraham, but not very successfully. In other words, Abraham is not comforted at all, and therefore the chapter continues as it does. But first, just as far as the articulation, the language used of God's appearing before Abraham, like I said, it is not the typical language, right? The Lord came to Abraham in a vision, saying, not God said to Abraham so and so, but the Lord came to Abraham in a vision, saying, so forth. We have like a language which is quite reminiscent of prophetic, right, revelation, right? The word coming before a vision, etc. And this already puts us in a different, position, not the typical story we find in the book of Genesis and the stories of Abraham. Now, God tells Abraham not to fear, and like we said, in this instance, if we don't connect it to the fears of the previous chapter, seems like Abraham is not comforted and something else disturbs him. So we continue reading on in the chapter. And Abraham said, Lord God, what will you give me, seeing I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abraham said, look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir. So Abraham rejects the comforting of the Lord here and says, you told me my reward is exceedingly great. What good is all this reward? What good is all that you give me? Right? I don't have a child. Who's going to inherit? Who's going to inherit me? Who will I give all my reward, my wealth to? Now, whoever reads verses 2 and 3 immediately, of course, has a question, because both verses begin similarly. And Abraham said, and once again, in the beginning of verse 3, and Abraham said. Now, the obvious question is, why the double and Abraham said? This question probably is also what lies behind a different version in some of the translations, including, for example, some versions of the ancient Greek Septuagint, we don't have the double and Abraham said, but one and Abraham said, and that could be in order to overcome this question of what is this double and Abraham said. By the way, also the Vulgate tried to overcome the problem and said and Abraham continued saying, right? Yosef Abraham apparently was in order to overcome it. And by the way, some English modern translations also adopt that. And Abraham continued in order to overcome that double Vayomer, and Abraham said. However, in the Masoretic, we read the double Vayomer, and it's of course not unique to our story here. An interesting suggestion amongst the modern scholar was to see a difference between the two sayings. The first one being a little harsher, right, and therefore suggested that perhaps it was said by Abraham in his heart, not externally, while the second, which is a little more refined and not as aggressive, if you will, was said out loud to God, right? So first, God, Abraham was thinking, what will you give me, seeing that I go childish? Well, why promise me telling me my reward is great? What good is that? Look, I only have my heir is my servant Eliezer of Damascus. And then he speaks out and says, look, you have given me no offspring, right? So I don't know how good this reward is for me. So that's an interesting suggestion. However, the more probable reading is as suggested in a whole article devoted to the whole question of the double Vayomer by Meir Shiloach, Vayomer in Hebrew. He says that the double Vayomer often denotes an expectation for a response by the speaker, but a lack of. So basically, Abraham is saying twice Vayomer because there was no response. He was waiting for God. God didn't respond, and then he continues with his second articulation of the same question. So I think that is the right way to go here, and I also accept Professor Grossman's Jonathan Grossman's suggestion here that this double Vayomer may also hint that this is an ongoing kind of debate and questioning that Abraham has. In other words, it's not just a one-time dialogue, but the double Vayomer, and Abraham said implies that this is something which is in Abraham's mind, and he's been saying it continuously over an extended period of time, and he doesn't have an answer to it. He's always asking, what's going on? Why don't I have offspring, right, with all the promises that I have received? And this could be this suggestion to read it as something which is representative of an ongoing thought or ongoing questions that Abraham raises towards God is strengthened by the continuation in verse 4. And behold, right, the word of the Lord came to him saying, the description and behold in Hebrew, vehine, right, that implies some kind of a sudden change. Vehine, surprising appearance of the word of God to him. So we're not like in a state of dialogue, but suddenly Abraham finally gets an answer to his ongoing questions. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him saying, this one shall not be your heir, right? Talking about Eliezer, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir. So we have a promise here. No, you will have a son of your own, a biological son who will inherit you. But the story doesn't stop here. It continues very interestingly. Then he brought him outside and said, look now towards heaven and count the stars if you are able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. So God lends further, I guess, support to his promise with an actual physical act, not only a verbal utterance of a promise, but a physical act of taking Abraham out, and that means, I guess, outside of his tent, and then asking him to count the stars, and the stars symbolizing the large number of offspring that God promises to Abraham. Now, the question is why this additional physical act, and what's its significance? It's quite unusual that God, the text says that God took Abraham out and showed him the stars. What's behind this, and why specifically via the stars? Some have suggested an interesting idea that stars are, of course, there, but sometimes you don't see them during the day. So maybe God wants to tell Abraham, well, you might not see the possibility, but it's there, it exists, and it's going to actualize. That's as far as the symbolism behind the action. But what's the symbolic significance in the language of taking Abraham outside, and letting him, or asking him to look at the stars? That might also imply a message to the patriarch here that he has to view things differently. He has to step out beyond the mundane reality in which he now finds himself and understand the divine perspective here. Something else is brewing here. God has a different plan, and even if it looks unlikely to you and doesn't seem realistic, the vision here encourages Abraham to understand that God will fulfill this promise, and you have to look at it from the divine perspective, not from the mundane. Look at the stars, see how things look above. The sages even said he took him out of the atmosphere from looking. But I think the idea is he has to get out of his worldly perspective here and understand that things are going to work differently than expected. So we move on to Abraham's response in the following verse after he was taken out. Verse 6, and he believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him as righteousness. So first we see the statement that he believed in the Lord. Abraham believed in the Lord. Now, this statement already lends a different perspective to the whole story, which we identify as the conclusion of the first unit, if you will, in the chapter. The fact that we conclude with the statement that Abraham believes lends an aspect of, I'd say, even a test to this section. In other words, Abraham passed the test of faith. He did indeed believe as God told him. Because it's not just a story here of God comforting, but there's also an aspect of testing Abraham's faith, and Abraham withstood the test, and he indeed did believe. The interpretive challenge here in this verse is to understand how to read the continuation. We've got the aspect of faith, and he believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him as righteousness. Now the question is, who is the subject behind this statement? And he accounted it him as righteous. Who is the he and who is to him? Of course, there are two possibilities. It's either Abraham continuing to be the subject. He believed, and he also viewed this. He accounted it to him as righteousness, as something which is correct and right. This promise. Or alternatively, we can say, and of course that's easier as far as the subject continuing from the first part of the verse to the second. Abraham, he believed, and he accounted it to him as righteousness. Although, as you could see, the capital here in the translation of the he understood that it refers to God. God viewed this as righteousness, in other words, something worthy of note, something noble, Abraham's actual faith. And if that's the way we read it, then it's clearly indicative of Abraham having passed this test and God viewing it very positively, the actual faith of Abraham. So we have in this section a story that ultimately revolves also around the faith of the patriarch in the promises. If up till now Abraham has been acting and doing things, Here we're informed specifically that he believes, even though it may be difficult, he believes in the promise of offspring given to him by God. So that is the first section. And then we continue on to the second unit, which deals with a new topic, and that is the topic of the promise of the land. Now, we'll begin reading, and we'll note that there's some difficulties, like we already mentioned, in understanding the flow and the connection with the previous unit. So, verse 7, then he said to him, I'm the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to inherit it. Suddenly we're talking about a new topic, the promise of the land. And he said, this referring to Abraham, Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it? Very surprising response of Abraham. God's already promised the land several times, but here Abraham asks, how will I know that it will be fulfilled? So here we also sense an aspect of questioning the promise. Some, of course, were hesitant to attribute to Abraham lack of faith. So they said it's not so much a questioning as much as a desire to see some more actualization or some more concretization of the promise. Although on a simple reading, Abraham says, how shall I know that I will inherit it? He's not certain that it will be fulfilled. So God responds to this, and he says as follows. So he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. We got a list. By the way, the Hebrew is not the common term for 3-year-old or in general describing language, right? Usually, if you want to say, for example, the common 1-year-old, you say ben shana, so the parallel would be ben shalosh. But look at the language here, chali egla meshuleshet, right, which is not ben shalosh, shalosh is 3, but meshuleshet, be'ez meshuleshet, ayil meshulash. What's the significance of this term? So you could see it was translated here as 3-year-old, but it's the commentators debated how to understand the term meshulash. Some said that indeed we're talking about a 3-year-old. Others, including amongst the sages and some of the Middle Age commentators, understood it to mean 3 heifers, 3 goats. Those are the 2 main options. Are we talking about a 3-year-old, or are we talking about 3 animals? If we're talking about 3 animals, then we're talking about a total of 9, 3 times 3 plus another two birds. A third interesting option that has come up in modern commentaries is that we're talking about splitting up the animal. As Abraham understands that he's supposed to separate the animals after he slaughters them into parts, and they said separate into 3, right? A 3-part animal. There you'd split up down the middle, and perhaps the head of the animal, pardon the description, would be the 3rd part. That is also an option as far as understanding. But God responds to Abraham's questioning with the command to start taking all these animals, and Abraham seems to understand what he has to do. So we continue in verse 10. Then he brought all these to him and cut them in 2 down the middle and placed each piece opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds in 2. And when the vultures came down on the carcasses, Abraham drove them away. Now, when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abraham. Now, notice here we have a reference to the time. Like I said, we have here the mention of the sun setting. Of course, when we read the chapter in order, so we saw earlier on that Abraham saw the stars. So how can suddenly we be referring to the sun setting? Different possible solutions have been suggested to this question. One, including some middle-aged commentators like Radak, have stated that the first section was in a vision, and therefore it could be understood as taking place in a dream, and hence the mention of stars could be just within the dream, and therefore we don't have to relate to the chronology of the first section. That's one possible interpretation. Now, in general, I think, let's say there are commentators, for example, like Maimonides, who think that every appearance of God to Abraham, any speech, is always in a dream, which is a very extreme statement. And I don't think suits the text. Here, it explicitly states, and by the way, this is one of the points against Maimonides, here it explicitly states that it's a vision. It doesn't say so in other places. So perhaps only here it was really a vision. But then the question is, was the speech only in a vision, or when he takes him out, is that already when he is awake? That is, of course, the question. As far as the chronology and the solution that we're saying that it was a dream. Another possible solution is that no, we have an ongoing, constant chronology here. The first section took place at night. How do we find ourselves suddenly with the sun setting? Well, because it took a full day to prepare all the animals. Don't forget, God commanded Abraham to take the different animals, slaughter them. This is something which takes time, and it took him the day to prepare all of this, and hence we are basically with a continuing flow of time throughout the narrative. The only difficulty I find with this is that in other points in the narrative, let's say when a day transpires or Abraham wakes up, so sometimes it says, right, and Abraham woke up by Ashkem Avraham Baboker, right? We have that, for example, in the story of the destruction of Sodom. So he spoke to God, and then the following morning we're informed he goes and sees how everything, smoke is rising from the valley, right? Or so with the story of the binding of Isaac, how he wakes up early in the morning. Here we don't have any statement relating to the passage of time, right? So I'm not certain that this solution is absolutely convincing. And this is one of the questions which led many commentators, both ancient and modern, to claim that we're talking about two units. There are even radical statements in amongst the sages that the story of the covenant of the peace has actually transpired well before the promise of offspring in the beginning of the chapter. So and some modern commentators have just said we have two separate units here that indeed transpired in different times. Don't try to correlate the flow of time between them because they occurred different in different periods, but they were put together just from a literary perspective. We'll relate to our conclusions on this point at the end. But first of all, I want to try to understand the significance of this whole scene of the taking of the animals, splitting them, and the conclusion. But for that, let's just continue till the end as far as the text is concerned. So Abraham took them, and in verse 10, he brought all these to him. We read this, right? and he drives away the vultures, which is very interesting. Why are they mentioned here? We don't need them. They don't seem to add anything to the text. We continue on reading. Now, when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abraham. And behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. Then he said to Abraham, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great wealth. Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, which means you pass away. You shall be buried at a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And it came to pass, when the sun went down and it was dark, so now we're already in darkness, that behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between those pieces. On the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, and the list of the different nations, right, concluding the chapter. We have here an act which carries a lot of significance. God tells Abraham to prepare the animals, and then he reveals also, once this is done, he reveals to him the future relating to the land. Abraham asked, how will I know that that I will inherit the land? Let's go back to Abraham's question. And he said, Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it? What's God's answer? You will not inherit it yourself, right? And that will also explain why suddenly in the midst, when God is speaking about the future of the descendants, right, that your descendants will be strangers in the land, of course, referring to the Egyptian bondage. They will afflict them 400 years, the suffering of the people, and then the judgment of the afflictors, of the Egyptians, and the departure with great wealth. Then there's a statement regarding Abraham. Now, as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, you shall be buried at a good old age. So why do you suddenly return to Abraham? Well, I think that's the answer to Abraham's questioning. How shall I know that I will inherit it? The answer is you will not inherit it. It will only be inherited well later, right? Only the fourth generation shall inherit it, as it said, right? But in the fourth generation, they shall return here. And as for you, you won't inherit it, but you will live a good life and a lengthy life, etc. What is the reason that Abraham will not inherit the land himself? The explanation is given at the end. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. The Amorites are the nations, the hill country, who are also, by the way, living with Abraham, as we saw in the previous chapter, and had a pact with him, right? They're the ones who fought with Abraham in the war against the four kings, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, right, who were in Abraham's pact. So I guess they were positive people, and at least at this stage, in the time of Abraham, weren't deserving of being punished. And hence, in a statement of tremendous significance, also theological significance, we're informed that God cannot give the land to Abraham right now because one of the peoples doesn't deserve to be punished and be expelled from the land. And therefore, we need time until their iniquity reaches a level which justifies their being expelled and giving their land to the Israelites. Of course, the inference here is, or the message here is, that the giving of the land is dependent upon the sin of the dwellers. Right? God won't just take the land away from people because He wants to give it to the Israelites, but rather it is also a punishment for the sinful dwellers of the land. And if there's a people who don't deserve to be punished, then that land cannot yet be given to Abraham. So it'll be given later on for generations. Now, what we have to try to understand here, it's clear we beyond the description here of a covenant, which is explicitly stated, right? And the conclusion, on the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, right? So this seems to be a scene of a covenant. We have to understand the significance of the actions, including the animals, the splitting up of the animals, the splitting up only of the three larger animals, not the birds. The birds were not. And also the appearance of the vulture that Abraham manages to keep off. What's going on here? It's clear that we have something that is symbolic in its actions and has to be understood. There's some kind of code here that has to be deciphered with all their details. And indeed, different suggestions have been raised in trying to decipher and explain this whole event. One common proposal, also amongst modern scholars, is that the splitting of the animals is symbolic of cutting a deal, cutting literally, right, a deal, and a covenant, and its significance is on what will be the outcome of breaking the covenant. Namely, you go between the pieces, right? And basically what you understand is that if you aren't loyal and don't uphold the covenant, the outcome will be death, right? And there are some examples from the ancient Near East of such covenants being performed, including from Al-Allah and from Mari, and viewing the pieces, one even explicitly stating that the cutting of the pieces is a warning of punishment by death to whoever will not be loyal and uphold the covenant. The difference here is that we have at the end a statement of the fire, right, going between the pieces, which of course represents God, right, going between the pieces. And we don't have any explicit example where you're supposed to go between the pieces. Sometimes the pieces are laid before and explained. Whoever will transgress, like in Allah, will be punished and by death. So it's a possibility, but it's not certain that this is the significance that we have in our story with Abraham. Another possibility raised by the sages and also some middle-aged Jewish commentaries is that we have here sacrifices. These were offered as sacrifices. Indeed, the animals that are mentioned here are animals that are pure and are offered, also the birds are offered as sacrifices. And therefore, some commentators suggested that this is what's going on here. Abraham is offering sacrifices, and as, let's say, an outcome of his sacrifices, he is deserving of the promise of the land. Nachmanides buttressed that suggestion with by pointing out that the birds are the only ones that are not divided, and that's also the law in the offering of sacrifices in the book of Leviticus, where it says explicitly that you do not divide, you keep the bird intact, right? So that's what we have here. Abraham did not separate the birds, and that's as is supposed to be done in the offering of sacrifices. So some of the commentators suggested even that the number, for example, Rashi says, he brings a list of the sacrifices offered, three of each animal found in different places in the Torah. Ramban says the number three here. They all relate to the numbers, right? Number three relates to the three types of offerings that exist, and the Olah, the Chatat, and the Shlamim. We have Allah, the offer, the total offering that rises up to God, and the sin offering and the peace offering. That's why we have the number three animals being offered here. The difficulty with viewing this as sacrifices is that we don't have an altar mentioned. There's no mention of what's done with the blood. In the offering of sacrifices, we have the altar, and you have this always the spilling of the blood upon the altar. That does not exist in our story. So it's a little problematic to view this as a sacrifice. Some have taken it in a more meta-historical kind of perspective, something hinting towards the future events that are described here, how the Israelites will suffer amongst other nations. And therefore, the three animals that are cut represent different nations that will bring suffering upon the Israelites, whether it be the Persians, the Babylonians, etc. And only the birds will remain intact, and the birds here representing the Israelites. That's a suggestion that also appears in the Middle Age Jewish commentaries as well. But in my opinion, it is the most convincing approach to deciphering what's going on with the animals is connecting it directly to the content that is given to Abraham, right? God's speech after Abraham prepares the animals as he was commanded. And here we have a suggestion that was also raised by Beno Yaakov and connects directly to the words of God. Let's repeat what is mentioned as far as the prophecy. We have only the fourth generation, right? But in the fourth generation, they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Why? How does this connect with all the animals? Well, if we say that he took three animals and split them up, these may represent the three generations that shall not inherit the land. They will not be complete. When will the land be inherited? Only in the fourth generation, and that fourth generation is represented by the bird, right? We have here three animals that were cut, right? He cut them in two down the middle, but he did not cut the birds in two. Why? Because the birds are the only ones who are actually going to inherit the land. Of course, one may ask, why two birds? And here I'll suggest that the two birds may represent one generation, or hint, one generation that will leave Egypt, will break away from the bondage in Egypt. But as we know, it'll be a different generation that will actually enter the land, and therefore the two birds may represent a two-step, right? Two generations in actually reaching the land. One breaking away from Egypt, and the other one inheriting the land. And then, if we continue with this symbolism, then we have the vulture that comes down upon the carcasses may represent, right, dangers and challenges to the inheritance of the land, to accomplishing that special relationship between God and the Israelites, whether it be the Egyptians giving chase, right, after the Israelites leave, or other dangers, including the Amalekites on the way, whatever it might be. We have here something which is symbolic, I think, and represents the future history of the Israelites in response to Abraham's query as far as when or how does he know that he will indeed inherit the land? And finally, this covenant is ratified with the fire going between the pieces as if God signs on the contract, right? Accepting and promising to fulfill all that has been said. So that leads us back to our opening question. After we've analyzed these two parts, the promise of offspring and the promise of the land, how to view them as two separate units or one ongoing narrative. Now, earlier on, we showed the difficulties involved in reading them as one narrative. We said how there's an ending in verse 6, and therefore it seems like a separate unit, and the chronological problem that arises upon reading it, and the fact that they seem to be totally separate. On the flip side, we have to also view reasons why it is likely and possible to read the two units as one ongoing narrative. And that is, for starters, first of all, if you look at verse 7, even though verse 6 seems to be an end, but that would make verse 7, of course, an opening. But if we go back to verse 7, it opens, then he said to him. Now, if this is an opening of a unit, then he said to him, who is him, right? And he wasn't mentioned. Only if we have an ongoing, flow of a read, then we know that verse 7, Vayomer Elav, to him, refers to the person mentioned in the previous verses, namely Abraham. So for starters, verse 7 seems to give us a continual flow of a read. That is one reason. Another one is the common structure. And that's one of the questions I asked you to do, compare the two sections. So the common structure between the two units is striking, right, and quite unique. Both sections begin with a statement by God, right? Whether it be God comforting Abraham in the first unit, do not fear, the reward is great, or God opening up in in the second unit with the promise of the land. We'll see it again here in verse 7. Then he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to inherit it. So we have an opening of a promise by God, or some statement by God, a comforting by God. What's interesting is, and this is amazing, in both units, if you will, Abraham responds with a questioning of God, right? How will I know in the second one? And what good are all your promises when I don't have any offspring? And then this is followed by a response by God. And in both responses, we have God performing or asking Abraham to do an action, which includes also like a physical kind of response, taking Abraham outside. Not only speech, we have speech, but also a physical action of taking Abraham outside and seeing the stars, or asking Abraham to take the animals and prepare them for the covenant. And this, and then the next stage is a finalization and evaluation, right, of the whole unit. Abraham believed, and then God, if that's how we understood it, appreciates Abraham's faith, or in our section, a conclusion that states that on the same day God made a covenant, promising him the land and determining kind of the extent of the land and its borders. So we got a very similar structure of the two units. Such similarity, can't be, of course, accidental, and strengthens the connections between the two units. Finally, we also, on the level of linguistics, we have certain common roots and words that appear. Perhaps the most striking and important is the name of God, as it appears in this chapter twice, both in responses of Abraham. When Abraham responds in the first unit, the name of God is Vayomer Avraham Adonai, right? You see Adonai, and then the tetragrammaton, right? The name of the holy name of God, right? We read it Adonai Elohim when it appears in such form, and similarly, that is in Abraham's response in the second section, Vayomar Adonai, and once again the tetragrammaton, the holy name of God. Now you should know that this dual appearance of two names is very uncommon. It appears only once more in the book of Deuteronomy within the Torah. So it is something that's quite unique twice within this chapter, once in each unit, and both times in Abraham's initial response to God's promise or comforting. In addition, we have the similar roots, the root of Yatzah, right? Vayotze took him out, Vayotze oto achutza, and when God reveals himself, he says, Asher hotzeiticha, I'm the one who took you out of Ur of the Chaldeans. So we got similar root of Yatzah, and we also have the relation to offspring, right? Yerusha, Yarash, to inherit. So we got the promise of Lo Yerashcha, and the promise of the inheritance of the land in the second section as well. So all these also push us to see some commonalities and to view this as an ongoing story. One more issue that we have to relate to is Abraham's characterization. In the first section, Abraham is described as being one of faith. He believes in God at the end, at least, right? He definitely believes in God. Whereas in the second one, he suddenly questions, right? How will I know that I will inherit it? Now, if you read it as one flow, wait, 1 second Abraham believes, and the second time he kind of lacks faith in the promise of the land. That, of course, led to some commentators suggesting that Abraham does not disbelieve God's promise of land, but he wants some more actualization of it, some stronger sign that indeed he will inherit, and that even if he sins, he will inherit. Some of the middle-aged Jewish commentators, including Nachmanides, took it in that direction, and that helps in the understanding of the characterization of Abraham. On the flip side, if you say that they're two separate units, there's no problem. Okay, at one point, Abraham was of faith, but on the second one, at a different time, he lacked faith. So it all depends on how we relate to this unit and the relationship between the two parts of the chapter. What's problematic and challenging here is that there are signs that push us towards viewing it as separate units, primarily the chronology, but there are also certain signs that show us how they're so intricately connected. And this brings me to the conclusion that we should have a kind of middle ground approach here. On the one hand, they may have taken place at separate times, not necessarily as the units are described in the flow of the chapter, but on the flip side, they are clearly integrated from a literary perspective. As a lot of work was done to integrate them, and they are meant to be read one after the other. This is the intention of the narrative, and this is how it's supposed to be read. Why, if they were indeed originally, let's say, kind of separate topics, if you will, why were they connected? Well, that's simple, because the themes of the promise of offspring and the promise of the land are often found together. But then we have to ask, okay, but why then as separate units? Why not integrate them totally into one? And I think this may be because there is significance in isolating the two components of the covenant, if you will, which include offspring and also of the land. They are. It's not a package deal that is all or nothing. It's very important, I guess, to emphasize here that each stands on its own. One, the promise of offspring. In other words, a people that will be the people of God. And the second, that people of God will eventually inherit the land. But this people of God can exist independently, like the nature of the prophecy here, that they will be in a foreign land and subdued in a foreign land. Um, this people, this people's existence does not depend upon the land, and hence they are separate. But the people is meant to be on this land, and therefore the covenant is eventually finalized in relation to the land. By the way, the ordering is very clear. Even if there are chronological problems. One relating to the night and stars, the other one to evening beforehand. The starting point is, of course, from the people. You cannot have a promised land without a people, and hence the ordering is necessary to teach us that one has to preempt the other. The people preempts the land. On and why is there only a covenant at the end? Well, it's not that the covenant only relates to the land, even though the covenant portion focuses on the land, but it's with the land that we have the integration of the two. In other words, the people that are promised will dwell on this land. Let us now conclude with the meaning, I think, of this chapter. Here there's something that is quite interesting in this chapter. We're informed in both parts that there is a promise, but the promise is slow in its actualization. God promises Abraham offspring, but it'll take a while till he will have a child. And God promises the land, but it will take a long time till that promise will be actualized. What do we learn from this chapter, and also Abraham's response to it? We have a covenant, but a covenant which also includes a long process and also even suffering along the way, and is dependent upon great faith. Ultimately, we learn from this chapter that while there are promises to Abraham and to his offspring, these promises are going to be a long time in their actualization, and there will be a long route, including suffering. And the greatness of Abraham, and as a consequence, also the greatness of his offspring, will be their faith, even throughout all the sufferings and lengthy road that they have to take and the ups and downs. They will always hold on to their faith, right? And ultimately, God says, even if it will take many generations, the people will eventually inherit the land, and the covenant will forever hold, and it will eventually reach its actualization. And here we see Abraham's suffering, his questioning, right? He has no children, and he's suffering because he has no children. And we see how the people will suffer when they are in a foreign land. But their commitment and belief and faith is what makes them into the chosen people. And it is the covenant which gives them the faith that even if the route is very long, it will eventually reach its fulfillment.